So when it finally came, I jumped at the opportunity to be able to make one of these presentations, and then suddenly realized that this is maybe a really dangerous thing because I actually care about this. And so if this leads to some heated or sparked conversations on this campus, I will be thrilled about that. If that means that I have to be dragged down because of that, I guess then that's the sacrifice I'm willing to make this morning. But I feel incredibly gratified that you've all come out at 9 o'clock in the morning. This is really early for you, and I appreciate that you're willing to do that. And so, thank you very much for doing this. So, yeah, I've put forward a provocative title, and oftentimes there's a kind of bait and switch that people put forward a provocative title and then show you why they actually don't think that title is actually very meaningful. And I'm not going to do that, which is, like I said, a little bit terrifying because I might be stepping on a lot of toes. And if I do so, again, I would love to have a civil discussion with you about it anytime, not just in the time today. I will try to build in a few minutes, though, at the end of the time for us to have some discussion here as a group, but our time is precious. So for the most part, I'm just going to kind of barrel through, and then we'll have time for discussion afterwards. But I need to have a few definitions that I set out first so that you understand at least what I'm talking about, so we have kind of a basic understanding. And I just made these definitions up off the top of my head, so I apologize if there's ways that you can find that they're not exactly appropriate, or if there's various sort of subtle differences, distinctions that you want to take me on about or attack, then this is the point to do it, or at least these are the points to come back to. So we will have as our arch villain for today what I am calling transcendent nationalism. And so I need you to understand what I mean by nationalism. So what I mean by nationalism, I have defined here as a belief that there exists a national character greater than the sum of the individual parts of the country, driven by a national spirit of shared values, ideals, and qualities. I see in my mind, and again, this is perhaps a weakness in my mind, and so a great point to come and challenge me if you want. I see a distinction in my mind between nationalism and patriotism. Patriotism, I understand, and I won't refer to patriotism much from this point on. I'll mostly talk about nationalism, but my understanding of patriotism is this: a willingness to self-sacrifice for the improvement of the country. So one sees a spirit, a community, a mystical community that is embodied under the symbols of the nation and in the populace of the nation that leads us to greater and better and larger end results. The other is a personal decision to submit oneself for the betterment of others. Right? So I see a fairly sharp distinction between nationalism and patriotism. So please understand that when I'm talking about some of these things, I'm not trying to attack the idea that somebody could be patriotic. But again, that's a point where you could definitely say I've done that. So I am open for that criticism. I have another definition for you. Idolatry. And what I came up with, again, at the top of my head, definition of idolatry is this: the projection of qualities of the divine to an object that is not divine. I hope that's a fairly straightforward one. I think that fits as a fairly biblical definition of what idolatry is or what idols are. Right? So the projection of the divine qualities onto things that are not. All right. So I started out with all these caveats and definitions. Let me break it down into a little bit things that are a little bit more levity. And these were really easy to find. I just went onto YouTube and typed in patriotic commercials, and I found lots and lots and lots of them. And so I just grabbed a couple from the top of the list, and I want to show you them. And as you're watching them, I don't only want you to watch with that kind of cynicism that I know that many of you have of sort of looking and saying, how are they using these ideals of the nation and using that to hawk wares? Of course, I want you to be cynical in that sense always when you're watching commercials. But I want you to look and say, what is it that these commercials are saying that they think the population is going to affirm about the qualities of what it means to be an American? Of some kind of extra additional strength, power, reality that Americans have simply because we're Americans. All right? All right, example number 1. Example number 2. The funniest thing, though, maybe about American nationalism is that it's actually not an American idea. And so one of the things that I want to show you is I want to show where this idea of nationalism, this idea of community came from, how that was connected to all kinds of symbols, and how those symbols have then been transferred or taken over by Americans, or new symbols created by Americans, in order to create this sense of a communal identity that can be used for political, military, for even commercial gains. So I, again, have a kind of thought experiment. So just simply this kind of question of what is the symbol that most people would associate most closely with the United States? All right, so I hear people already saying it. So you guys, right? So this is kind of the question of what would you put on your travel brochure to say you were coming to America? And, right? And so some of you have already guessed it. I think most of you would think the Statue of Liberty. The Statue of Liberty is the symbol of Americanness. But then we have to start to say, well, where did the Statue of Liberty come from? And why do we have that definition? Right, the Statue of Liberty, as you guys all know, was a gift from France to the United States in 1886. And what I want to do is I want to follow the symbols of the Statue of Liberty, or of the embodiment of liberty, a little bit backwards in French history. So in French history, the embodiment of liberty also actually has another name, Marianne. And Marianne is the embodiment of France. Anytime you buy like French stamps, they still have Marianne. They always go and find whoever the hottest model is at that particular moment, and they picture her and create these images of Marianne. But I'm going to go back to times before the French Revolution. So, for instance, just 6 years before the French gave the United States the Statue of Liberty, they built their own Marianne, their own Statue of Liberté, in Paris in 1880 at the Place de la République, the Square of the Republic. Right? So a place that centers itself on republicanness within France. Now, French history, only since 1870 had they been democratic in any sense, or republican in any sense. They were in the Third Republic, and so this was a kind of embodiment of them going back to their ideals, going back to the first French Revolution. All right. So you probably actually have a more famous representation, French representation of liberty or of France in your mind when you think about French presentations of this. And so for the next one, I want to actually go back a couple generations earlier to another time where French people were trying to say what it is we as French people have collectively that is trying to help us to overthrow tyranny. And so going back to 1830, Eugene Delacroix painted Liberty Leading the People. Notice still the exact same posture that the Statue of Liberty has. One raised hand, right? A forward motion, right? I guess the Statue of Liberty is a little more static, but kind of a forward motion that suggests something about the nation, right? Here, liberty is not just a single revolutionary, but rather an embodiment of all of true France rising up against the restored Bourbon monarchy in 1830. But this wasn't the first time that Marianne had shown up there either. Marianne had already shown up back in the French Revolution. And during the French Revolution, Marianne becomes the embodiment of many French ideals. And we have to understand that during the French Revolution, all kinds of new ideas were coming forward, all kinds of new political units, new political organization, new political ideals. And of course, because all of this was new, people, especially people in power, needed to have some kind of language that they could communicate to the populace what this meant. So they were oftentimes borrowing symbols from other worlds, particularly religious worlds, and bringing that over and transferring it over to the French system and the French situation of the French Revolution. So notice this picture. Here we have Marianne in repose. Still one arm raised, but Marianne in repose. She's waiting. She's a little more staid. This is Marianne of the Directory, for those of you who know the French Revolution. But we might go back actually a couple generations even before the French Revolution and find another Marianne. Of course, this isn't Marianne. This is Mary, the Mother of God. Mary, the Mother of God, the Savior of the world, the bearer of God. This is this larger transcendent reality that the French people, that the French government was trying to hold on to. And they understood that if you put these kinds of clothing on a woman and you portray her in this way, that many of the French peasants would automatically associate then Frenchness with the same kinds of community and the same kinds of hopes for salvation that they had had from their Catholicism. Because the French Revolution was explicitly saying we are something other than Catholicism. They were explicitly anti-clerical. And so they wanted very much to say you should not have your association, you should not have your identity bound up within the Christian or the Catholic Church. Right? You should have it instead bound up within the state of France. So the French really are examples. Now, some of you might say, hey, wait a second, the Americans had a revolution before the French. Shouldn't the Americans just be able to take credit for all of the stuff that you're talking about? And maybe there is, and I will defer to my Americanist friends over here, that they would be able to maybe talk a little bit more about that explicitly. But while there seemed to be some generation of new nationalistic ideals, and particularly a political culture during the late colonial period and the period of the Revolution, for the most part, that national identity was very quickly subsumed by a regional or a state identity. So that the nationalism of America really kind of gets stopped before it can really start. So we do need to look a little bit at the French as our first models of what this new kind of nationalism would look like. So the French had a few firsts, right? Like I said, the Americans had a kind of political culture they had developed during the French Revolution, so maybe that's not exclusively a first. But the French, right before the French Revolution, everybody thought the French were really docile, especially the lower classes. They didn't care about politics. One king would die, another king would come to power. Nobody really raised a fuss. But once the French Revolution began, or the steps to the French Revolution began, all of a sudden people started to care about politics. They started to feel like they had a voice. They started to engage in reading media, reading newspapers, and those political ideals that were going around. They began reading French philosophers and all of these different kinds of ideas. So people were started to develop this kind of political culture in the first place, where people could talk about what it meant to be French, what it meant, what kind of shared identity that they had. Likewise, the French leaders of the French Revolution were immediately engulfed in a civil war. So that you had the French revolutionaries fighting against the old French aristocracy. And many of the French, particularly the peasantry and the urban workers, they were torn on which way they should go, especially traditional Catholics. Should we support the aristocracy in the church because the Pope has said this is a bad revolution? Because our archbishops have said this is a bad revolution? Or should we support these revolutionaries? And so the French had an existential need, or the leaders of the French Revolution had an existential need to try to express what it was that they wanted in a French, what they meant by a French Revolution, what they meant by a virtuous republic, what they meant by this new nation. And they had to find some way to express this as quickly as possible. And the problem was that they were constantly dealing with a church that was pulling against them. So why not, they decided, hijack many of the symbols from the church and bring them over and turn them into symbols for the nation. And in doing so, they began to create that same sense of community that the church has always claimed for itself. The church has always been the community of one faith, the community of one spirit, the community of one baptism. We've always sensed, we've always affirmed a collective identity when we say our creeds. That even though we differ with each other, even though we oftentimes throw rocks at each other, we still affirm one Lord. And so the French began to take that for themselves. We have this one community. And they began to define this one community. Sorry, this is a real simple way of understanding nationalism. I use this for all of my intro courses, so if you've seen this all before, I apologize. But nationalism has three component parts. One is a shared or a collective sense of common origins. Right? We are the people who rose up against the king. We are the people who took liberty for ourselves. There's a reason that you learned about the Pilgrims long before you learned about the settlers in Virginia. Because that sense of identity, that sense of common origin of a people who were fleeing an oppressive state, wanting to create a city on a hill, to be a light to the rest of the world, who wanted to settle and be free and peaceful with their American Indian neighbors. I realize it's problematic. American Indian neighbors. That is a story that we want to teach our 3rd and 4th graders about who we are as a nation, far more than we want to talk about the initial settlements at Jamestown. So a sense of common origin is the first element. And the French were creating this, right? We are the people that go back to Charlemagne. We are the people who, go back maybe to Saint Denis. We are the people who, right, they had all these kinds of places where they could say, all of us, even though we're from different regions and we speak different languages and we've had different kind of ideals or leaders in the past, we all share this common origin story. All of these nations, right, nationalism not only has a sense of common origin, it also has a sense of common destination. We are the people who will become free. We are the people who will become a city on the hill. We are the people who will lead to a new destination. We are the people who will take over this nation, right? That in times of crisis, in times of, right, where national motivation and mobilization and unity is necessary, then we say, this is where we're going. One of the big problems that the American political world is experiencing right now is we all agree that there's a common destiny for us, but what that common destiny is very differentiated between different viewpoints. And then the third thing that is necessary is you need to have a strong sense of us versus them. You need to be able to say, we as a nation are different from those people. And within nationalism, usually those people are outside of the borders, but oftentimes we've seen, unfortunately, in the 20th century, those people can be found within the borders as well. Right, to use the most commonly used one, we Germans are not Jews, was the message of Hitler. Right, that sense of identity can be, right, we are not Canadians, oh, thank goodness, right, we are not, or we are not, the people within who we don't like, or we are not those, right? So finding some kind of an enemy to be able to set ourselves up against. Those three things were necessary, and the French revolutionaries needed this because they were in this war for the very existence of their revolution. I got an email, sorry. So they began to take, like I said, all these symbols from the Christian church, not just Mary. They did take Marianne. They also took martyrs. Right? Another famous painting that maybe you're familiar with is the Death of Marat. Marat was a French revolutionary hero, a spokesperson whose rhetoric could rile up the masses. But he was assassinated by a kind of crazed peasant and left to die in his bathtub. He took baths all the time because of a skin disorder. But he was left to die. And and notice that in David's painting of Marat, that he is in much the same repose that you might expect to see Jesus in a Pieta, right, where he's lying on the lap of Mary. He is clearly in a position of being a martyr. He is clearly somebody who has died for a larger purpose. He has died to become the seed that will bloom 100-fold. Right? Likewise, the French began to take these sort of ceremonies of religious celebrations and began to codify them in these big national celebrations, these big folks festivals, where they could bring the people together and talk about what it meant to be virtuous as a nation. And so they would find the prettiest girl in every community. They would name her Marianne. She would be able to sit on top of the mountain there, and everybody would kind of stand around them, and they would have a liberty tree, and they would kind of go in there, and they would sing songs together, and they would hear messages about the nation and what the nation meant. And so they were taking this, again, language that everybody understood as a religious language and transferring the transcendent identities and collective identities over to the nation. So like I said, the Americans only come to this fairly late. The Americans don't have that existential crisis, or they did during the Revolution, but then in the years afterwards didn't have it quite so neatly or quite so existentially, and so they devolved into a more regional identity. Until, of course, there was a crisis where that regional identity begins to break down, where a national identity, a national sense of purpose, a national sense of origin, and a very clear sense of who we are versus who they are needed to be formed. And this was, of course, the American Civil War. And in the midst of the American Civil War, they begin to, the government, powers that are in favor of the North, begin to codify and take many religious symbols, just like they had seen the French do, and begin to turn those into American-type symbols. So some of these might be familiar to you. The North had a martyr, John Brown. John Brown's body lies a moldering in the grave they could march to. Here was a person who had seen a better destiny for the United States, and he had been killed for it. They even took, right, because of course most Americans were Protestants, not Catholics, so instead of the really symbolism of Mary, at least initially, they took a much more Protestant identity, the hymn, and turned that instead from a Christian hymn extolling the virtues of a Christian God to a national hymn extolling the national purposes and direction. Right? So the Battle Hymn of the Republic was a creation of these things. You have a creation of sacred spaces. And this was something I didn't talk about the French Revolution quite so much, but it was definitely true there as well. One of the things that is interesting in American nationalism is that it begins to redefine how we understand space, place, and time. That generally speaking in traditional cultures, the religiously oriented places are those places that are the most holy or the most taboo. You guys still have this sense about you if you take off your take off your hat when you walk into a church, right? Or you would feel it somehow like more corrupt to rob a church than to rob a 7-Eleven. Right? You have that kind of natural, okay, you know this is a holier place than somewhere else. But what if we as a nation could turn certain places into places of particular holiness? So interestingly, there's actually even a resacralization. We took the land from General Robert E. Lee and turned it into a Union cemetery, Arlington National Cemetery, which becomes this place of particular holiness. Later on, we actually want to focus that holiness even more and bring in this idea of martyrdom as well. So after the First World War in Arlington National Cemetery, we set up one particular tomb that is known and renowned throughout the nation as maybe the holiest of places in the entire country, the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier. This place that needs to be guarded at all times because it is a place that upholds these ideals of the nation, these ideals of the collective identity. Right? During the French Revolution, this sense of time, or during the American Civil War, this sense of time also needs to be redefined. Again, if you go to lots of cultures, especially ones that have very long religious traditions, the church still dictates the calendar. The holy days, the sacred days, are those days that are religious ceremonies, right? Or if not the church, whatever the religion is, right? In the United States, we actually only have 2 religious days that get time and a half, right? Christmas and Easter. And of course, Easter's on a Sunday, so most people don't work that day anyway. So really, Christmas is the only day that's Christian, explicitly Christian, that Americans celebrate and say, this is a time where we're going to settle down, we're going to dictate, and we're going to schedule our world around this religious festival. All of the other days you get off, especially like if you work at a bank or for the national government, all the other days that you get off, these are days that are marked by patriotic or American celebrations. And look at what they think about. Memorial Day, a remembrance of the dead who died in battle. July 4th, Independence Day, a moment of our common origin. Veterans Day, a remember again of soldiers who have fought. Martin Luther King Day, or President's Day. Days celebrating particular Americans who somehow showed us or reoriented us towards what it means to be an American. And then maybe the holiest day of all in the American calendar, Thanksgiving. This day where we go and we say what it is that we are thankful for, what it is that we care for, all because of these origin stories of the pilgrims who came and began to settle and worked and survived because of the friendly Native Americans, and so they invited them to a banquet. And together we are this collective identity. Right? And there were proclamations of Thanksgiving going back to the early Republic. But Thanksgiving as a day to celebrate, as a day to stop, as a day to recognize a particular American virtue was first proclaimed by President Abraham Lincoln. As a time to create and forge a national identity in a time of crisis. So since the Civil War, there's been a lot of other stories. There's a lot of other stories that people could make movies about or write novels about that people could point to as being explicitly American, right? There's the expansion to the West. There's been the immigration of many nations. There have been other, sort of the development of sort of internal political decisions. But generally speaking, what most people point to is they point to particularly World Wars I and II as times that really forged an American, not only an American internal American nationalism, but also a projection of American nationalism overseas. A very clear image of what it means to be American and what the Americans think that the rest of the world should have. A ultimate destiny for the United States. So all of this is just simply to say that when we look at the symbolism, when we look at the ideals of Americanness that are often then put onto symbols like the flag that doesn't have any inherent meaning in and of itself. Right? I know, 13 stripes for the 13 colonies, stars for the states, so forth. But it doesn't have any particular sensibility that if you see it flapping in the distance that it should necessarily in and of itself warm your heart. But it does perhaps. Or when you watch the great national ceremony that is the Super Bowl pregame show, and you see that flag spread across the entire field, and you see those soldiers together, and you see those Patriot fans arm in arm with their Eagle fans, right? And we see that our country is marked not so much by our differences, but rather by our unity, and then the airplanes fly over the top, right? That we have that sense of identity. So that was my first one, which is simply, right, that the nation needed to have this language to try to express what it needed from its population, and they took it basically wholesale from the church. The funny thing for me has been not that the church has simply said, yes, this is what's happened, but that the church has begun to internalize this, make it more real, has begun to incorporate this back into the church. And this is problematic for me. right? I don't have a problem standing up at the beginning of baseball games and singing the national anthem. I'm not quite so sure what I should do in my church. Because the church also says we have a common origin. We are the body that grew up out of the blood of those martyrs because of the death and resurrection of our Lord. We are the community who has a collective identity under the Spirit, and our responsibility is to be the salvation of this world. We are the body of Christ. And we do have a sense of us versus them. But that sense of us versus them is us versus the dark forces of Satan and sin. Not us versus non-Christians, because those are just people that we also want to save. So we have all of those same elements that nationalism needs to become a real community. But in this way, we're bringing, especially within the American church, we're bringing that Americanness back into the congregation. And I don't know what to do with this. And I think there's two reasons why the church is excited or willing to bring Americanness into the congregation. One is because there is in many ways a sense of genuine cooperation of the calls of the state and the mission of Christ. When we look at America being the best that America has been, I think we can oftentimes say that's something that we as Christians could get alongside with, can get behind. At least sort of government actions, these kinds of things. Again, collective identity, I don't know how to quite assess that or measure that. But I think maybe even more we're driven by fear. We're driven by fear that if we stand up and we say, no, that my ultimate identity is with Christ and not with the state, that we're worried that we will be excluded. That we're worried that we'll be kicked out of any kind of civic discourse. That we're worried that we'll be marginalized. And that's a scary feeling. So where are we now? We have a world that's defined by the state for time. I made a little Facebook joke at the end of November and said, Happy New Year, everybody, time to put on purple, which was only a few people understood, right? It was basically me saying the new year in the church always begins at the beginning of Advent, right? Our time is no longer dictated by the church. Our time is dictated by the nation and national identity. Our place is dictated by national identity as well. We have these particular places, right? We have these particular symbols. We have these particular areas that we consider sacred and holy because they are connected to the state, because they're connected to the nation. Our community is divided, right? And actually, I think for the people who have become, interestingly, the greatest cheerleaders of nationalism, at least in the last couple of years, are in fact those people who are a part of the church. This coupling of them, right? That this is what it means to be an American. I can buy into that. I agree with that wholeheartedly, and I see no differentiation between that and my Christian calling and mission. And I think that we also have a sense of meaningness. Meaning is found oftentimes in our political results and ideals. Meaning is found in our political definitions. Meaning is found in those kinds of identities. That when you introduce yourself to somebody, I oftentimes do this sort of thought experiment, like what would be the first question you would ask if you met somebody randomly chosen from the other 7 billion people on this earth? What would be the first question you would ask? And I think almost every one of you, after maybe asking what their name is, because you're kind people, would ask, where are you from? And you would expect them to answer with a country, with a nation. And rather than saying, what's your faith, what's your creed, which would be, again, the much more traditional way of interpreting it, of understanding it. All right? We find meaning, this is me. I like watching the Olympics. We've been watching the Olympics. I find my meaning in like the snowboarders rocking in the Olympics, right? I find that there's some kind of great personal satisfaction that I get when they win, even though I've been on skis twice and it was not a good experience. All right? We look for messiahs in our national world, I think far more than we look for it in our religious one. We're oftentimes looking for these kinds of like national heroes, especially like in the pop culture, right? Anybody remember the great love affair with John and Kate +8 amongst the Christian circles? Right? This was, but nevertheless, I think that when we look for when we use messianic language, we use it for our political creatures, for our political creations. This is the person who will lead us on to a new and glorious age. And we are willing to sort of accept this. Yeah, this is the person. We have to agree entirely. This person is going to be our Savior. And then finally, of course, we have flags in our church. And so my dad was a missions pastor in my church, but he only became that once I was in high school. Before that, he was an elder. And as head of the elder board, it was his responsibility to look over, and they had redefined certain aspects of the church constitution, which is a sort of tedious and boring job that elder boards have to do, and most people usually just ignore it and don't even realize it's happened. But everything was moving swimmingly. They were just about to ratify the new one when somebody came in and said, "Why is the flag no longer at the front of the church?" Now, they had just moved it sometimes for like ease of movement in and off of the stage. It's a really big church and all this stuff. So they just kind of moved it. It was still there. It just was kind of off stage. And my dad said this went on for like 5 extra meetings. This discussion about why is the flag no longer at the front. And so we have this, right? This is something that we have totally and wholly incorporated within our church experience. So I find this very funny. We take all of these ideals that we so associate with the church, we transfer them over into national symbols. We embody or raise those symbols up as our greatest hopes, ideals, our greatest sense of community, and then we bring them back into the church. It's funny. It doesn't make sense to me. But I don't have, right? I generally just sort of sit and accept it. So, what do we do? I think, so just to kind of set the parameters of, and if we want to take this as a discussion, that's great. If you want to talk about anything else, that's also great. If you want to just set that as the parameters are, there's one end, right? Represented by the Amish, right? By Jehovah's Witnesses, others who say there is no connection whatsoever between the nation and the church, and so we will reject the nation entirely. We won't fight in the armies. We won't participate in any of this stuff, right? So that's kind of one extreme. The other extreme is maybe like what, First Baptist Church in Dallas, right? Jeffress's church, which is basically, the church congregation creating a song, "Make America Great Again," right? So that's kind of our extremes. And I think that there is a spectrum that can be questioned, that can be considered. And I think that probably each of us has to kind of answer. Are you willing, right? If you're in that sort of tendency, as maybe I am, towards the kind of Amish direction, are you willing to leave a church because it has a flag at the front of it? If you're in that other end, are you willing to sort of congregate with somebody who doesn't see American values? Are you willing to congregate? Are you willing to go to mission and overseas? That's not necessarily Americanist, or willing to accept national leaders who aren't American, right? Those are the kinds of questions that you have to do as you get towards the spectrum, the end of the spectrum. And those of us maybe who are trying to find a middle ground, I'm not sure what we should do. All right? So, do you have questions? Do you have thoughts? Do you have solutions? Yes. Mm-hmm. 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 Yeah. Okay. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Good. Again, I think that goes back to there are very real situations in which the one I can definitely understand, as it sounds like your husband understands it, that there was a coordination between those virtues and values of Americanness and Christian identity, and I wondered that as well. Not so much specifically with that situation, but just in a sense of like, is this kind of a, somebody correct me on the is it Romans 15, Romans 13, right? Is this like dealing with eating sacrificed food? Is it the kind of thing that, like, as long as you don't raise a question or a problem or whatever, you can do it in good conscience and Christians have freedoms to be able to do that? Or is this something that, no, it needs to be associated more, again, using early church examples, of, not sacrificing to the emperor? Again, I don't have a problem standing at baseball games, so I don't know if, but that's again me, and again I'm trying to find a middle ground. So I don't have a good answer for you, and I don't want this to necessarily be a dogmatic answer. I don't necessarily want this presentation to be a dogmatic one that leads you to say, in all situations this must be the case. But maybe that is what's needed. I don't know. Sorry, I'm going to be agnostic on that answer. I hope that's okay. Yeah. I would assume in all situations you would not find one in a mosque. I don't know about other ones. Certainly you would find one in front of a Mormon church, because Mormonism is very much connected to Americanism. So that's much more in that sort of extreme over here. But I can't answer that. I can say, right, some other churches do. In fact, those of you who maybe go to an Anglican or a Presbyterian church, you might actually see flags in the front, but that's a little bit of a different story, because an Anglican church has a flag, an English flag at the front of its church, because the monarch of England is in fact the head of the church. Likewise, within Scotland, there's sort of some of that connection as well. Or within the Presbyterian church, the head of the United Kingdom also is sort of the head of that church. So there is some reasons for them having those flags, which is a little bit different than just the kind of a collective identity or national identity of those churches. Sorry, that was, again, if maybe you've seen that. My other experiences traveling, and I probably haven't looked at enough churches, is generally speaking not to find countries' flags at the front of their churches. But yes.
What about the Christian flag? Where does that fit?
My assumption is it's part of this retrofitting. It's a part of this, right? The language started in the church. The language of symbols, the language of community, it was taken over by the nation. And then the church as kind of part of this, and we see actually this happens in France during the Reconstruction, or the restoration of the French monarchs, that the French church actually begins to take over some of those revolutionary ceremonies. But we see that I think it's a kind of an attempt to repatriate it, or to retake that language back into the church. I'm not sure what the origin of the Christian flag is, if it's more ancient than the American flag. I would doubt it. Certainly like the Pledge of Allegiance to the Christian flag is definitely a retrofitting of an American thing back into Christianity. So it's basically trying to say, hey, we want some of that collective identity, that larger purpose that now so many people see so wrapped up within the nation, and we do want to take that kind of back into the Christian church. So it's a kind of interesting dialogue, a back and forth of this language of symbols. But does anybody know the origin of the Christian flag? All right. I mean, obviously Crusaders and others fought under flags, but they look slightly different, at least, than the Christian flag. And that would be very problematic if that was what we were having at the front of our churches, but for different reasons. You had a question, I believe?
Yeah, actually, that's kind of what I was thinking about. Say, especially if you see the American flag, it's like you have to see our little race on the uniform, the things that we also install. I think for me, the most, and then if there's a flag up next to like a big cross in front of the church or something, it's really big. I was looking back in Correll, and I see the University of Jesus.
Right.
Right next to the church.
Right, so the place within the sanctuary, again, most Protestant churches that I've been to at least, the placement is always on stage. It's not in the back or off to the side of the church for the most part. So the placement is also, I think, is kind of an interesting symbolic language. It has something to do with the meaning of it, which has to do, I think, somewhat with the flag code as well. But is there another hand that I saw? Yeah, Jeff. Well, I think the early part of your question maybe even says, well, it's not really a Cassandra because that was a different, at least historical thing. And so, Mark, you're raising up all kinds of alarm bells here, but that's really fitting more within the German sense. Certainly my European sensibilities and my European training, and I do talk nationalism. My students make fun of me because they basically say Correll lectures like this, blah, 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 nationalism, blah, 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 nationalism, nationalism, blah, 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 nationalism. And there's a certain truth to that. That I see nationalism within the European context, especially within the 20th century, has, as a sort of a sum, been a more destructive force than a constructive force. And so I definitely think my love of European history makes me certainly wary of nationalism. And then my more specific history, now the things I don't study a whole lot of moving into the Second World War. I did a little bit of moving into the First World War, and I definitely did see moving into the First World War that the German church was all in favor of the German message of the traditional authorities of the Kaiser and the church, right? The Kaiser and the cross. This was kind of something that they saw as, this is good for us. The First World War, or all the militarism of the late German state before World War I, the empire, was essentially something that was productive and constructive, and that the church should hitch its wagon to the ascendancy of the German state as a way to be able to maintain cultural relevance and to be able to become more powerful in the voices of the people within the state. So certainly I do see that as a real problem with real ultra-patriotism within the church. Because that did not work out in the end really well for the German churches, because the rest of the story of the 20th century has been people saying, you promised us this and we got none of it. And so there's a real credibility gap that developed because of that. So maybe it might be that I'm seeing this through a European lens more than I'm seeing it through an appropriately American one. It's definitely a possibility. Yeah.
So if you're supposed to find our identity, our ultimate identity in Christ,
Yeah.
how can we, growing up in America and having this nationalism stuck on the throat from the time we were born,
Yes.
how do we fully do that when our ultimate identity is Christ, when the identity that we are is American?
Well, let me plug our cross-cultural programs. I do think that exposure to Christians from other parts of the world has been an incredibly important part for me to say maybe there are some things that are the manifestation of my faith that are really bound up within my own culture and not necessary. Likewise, that maybe there's some aspects of my faith that I've been missing out on because I've been excluding it because I thought it wasn't allowable because of my national identity. So I definitely think that the constant affirmation of the reality and existence of a church universal is always going to be a powerful, I don't know, antidote, a powerful at least check on the claims of the sort of the all-encompassing claims of a national identity here, right? So the smaller national identity that at a real simple level, and this is probably, you know, kind of more bumper sticker philosophy than I really want to go into, but I had a Bible professor in my undergraduate who had just kind of a sticker on the outside of his window that just simply said, what would happen if Christians said they were no longer going to kill Christians in war? Right? It's obviously it's right. What does it mean? And obviously, I'm thinking, I'm not a pacifist particularly. I don't know that historians do real well with that. Like, you always have to do this or always have to do this. History sometimes makes it a little bit hard to makes those kinds of decisions really fuzzy. So I'm not. I also don't want, you know, if any of you are soldiers or part of ROTC or have been soldiers, please don't see me as saying that there's not patriotism available or possible. And I could see somebody saying, "Hey, I'm willing to go to war. I'm willing to fight because I love my neighbors to the left and the right of me, and especially as you can sort of say, this person. I love the Faulkners and I love the Hills and I love Mrs. McGuire. So I'm willing to go to war for them." I have a lot of respect for that. I find it a little bit harder when there's sort of and I don't think I think that's the reason most soldiers go to war, or most soldiers they continue in war because they love their brothers, right? They love those people who are with them. I think a lot of people go into war because of these high ideals, but then when it comes down to it, it's the person next to me. I find that a lot more attractive, a lot more Christian than this kind of thing of like, well, I must go to war because we have this ultimate destiny as a nation. That's language that I find more difficult